So the piece that we're going to experience in a few moments is a piece that was that I wrote in 2016. St. James Episcopal Church has a tradition called the Good Friday Project. This year, I believe, marks the 33rd year of this tradition, where artists hold space the entire evening, and there is no clergy, there's no sermon. It is all artist reflections on their responses to the crucifixion experience. Artists are given space to reflect on various themes of this powerful day, and some choose things like unconditional love, forgiveness, reconciliation, betrayal, abandonment, and hope. This tradition started with artists like Boyd Vance and Anna Cisnet. If you've ever been to the Carver Museum, the theater is the Boyd Vance Theater. Boyd Vance was a force to be reckoned with, right? So there's all these amazing artists who were professional artists, and artists who were creative in their souls and their spirits, but maybe not in their everyday life. The project starts with a simple chime, and an artist gives their unfiltered performance, and then ends in silence with another chime, and this continues through the night until the final artist has made their piece, and then the final bell chimes, and the artists leave in silence. The Good Friday Project has no applause, no audience reaction, no audience talk back afterwards. Both the artist and the audience are left to sit and process on their own and throughout the week. The piece that I wrote in 2016 was a response to reading a magazine, a religious magazine, from the Diocese of Texas. The previous issue was about beloved community and racism and all the things that the church and the community were doing to have those kind of conversations about beloved community. And the first issue that I read was the issue that came immediately after that. And the first page that I opened were the letters to the editor, which were very angry and addressed things like, racism is not something that should be talked about in the church. It doesn't have anything to do with this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was very taken aback, right? Here it is, I belong to this beautiful spiritual community where people show up in love in so many beautiful ways. Inclusion and beloved community and kindness and love, right? This is the message. And then I was like, reading these were the filtered thoughts. Like, these were the letters that made it into the magazine, right? And so as you can imagine, I was struck. And then I remembered a few years before that, before I moved to Austin, when I worked at an anthropology museum that holds the largest collection of objects, items, and human remains that are subject to the Native American Grace Repatriation Act. And I was the advising curator on the first contemporary art exhibit in the Hall of the North American Indian in 18 years, the first new exhibit in 18 years. And so we had brought in these contemporary artists, one of which was Ryan Redcorn. And as you can imagine, being at Harvard, Ryan heard a whole lot of stuff. And so we had some moments where we shared some of the stuff. And then there was one particular poignant moment where Ryan was like, I wanted to react, and I was going to tell them exactly what I was feeling. And he said, no, I'm an artist. I'm going to put it into my work. And that artwork wound up being a part of the permanent collection at the museum. So after reading that magazine, I was like, I'm not going to react. I'm going to put it into my work. The original blurb about the piece is that it was called Were You There? With the traditional African-American spiritual, with excerpts from The Crucifixion, which is a piece in God's Trombones written by James Weldon Johnson. James Weldon Johnson is you probably know him from the song Lift Every Voice and Sing, right? And also has biblical verses. And I wrote that I've come to believe that the story of Jesus' life and crucifixion is known as the greatest story ever told because it is timeless, as relevant today as it was yesterday. In it, we can find ourselves, the persecuted, the abuser, the accuser, the comforter, the bystander, the forgiver, the forgiven, the pretender, the liar, the angry, the sorrowful, the hero, the storyteller, the healer, the accountable, the catalyst, the celebrated, and even the unaware. We are both one in all of these roles in our lifetime. It gives me reason to pause to ask myself, who am I in this moment in history? The words that you will hear, again, are a mix of words that come directly from news reports and magazines, and from the poetic verses from God's Trombones, written by James Weldon Johnson, and Bible verses. While this response was specifically to a very particular magazine, it certainly could have been written about many of the reactions of UUs that I've read relating to the eighth principle. And so we invite you to hold space and experience this in the tradition of the Good Friday Project. There will be chimes, there will be moments of silence, and then we will end in silence where we can all process and take away from the project what we need.
Well, I'm ready for this. But first, we're going to do a communal lament by another spiritual leader. This is by a minister named David Breeden. He's a UU minister. We're going to do it in the form of a back and forth conversation. I believe the words will be there. We have green and we have black. I hope you can see those differences. And folks on Zoom, feel free to chime in whichever way you want or both ways. I'm going to split us this way, which gives us a little bit more voices here, but that's okay. We'll just have to speak up a little bit over here. So let's let these folks begin with the green, and then we'll go this way. We'll go back and forth. And I'll read both. We cry out in grief at the suffering we see. People, all living things, the planet. It continues on and on. When we feel overwhelmed, we gather to find a path, to find new ways forward. When we feel overwhelmed, there we go. When we feel overwhelmed, we know that to our right and to our left are the faces of caring, faces of companionship. Joining together, we find our refuge, we find our strength, we find our wisdom, we find our way forward.
Where are you going to? Just want to point out that Bettina, Daniela, and Sheila are going to join me in this. Were you there when they crucified my Lord?
Dear editor, the issue of racism is not a black one, nor is it actually relevant at this time.
Were you there when they crucified my Lord?
Dear editor, the issue of racism is not a black one, nor is it actually relevant at this time.
Sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble.
Dear editor, the issue of racism is not a black one, nor is it actually relevant at this time.
Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Jesus, my gentle Jesus, walking in the dark of the Garden of Gethsemane, saying to the 3 disciples, sorrow is in my soul. Even unto death, tarry ye here a little while and watch with me.
Jesus, my burdened Jesus, praying in the dark of the Garden of Gethsemane, saying, Father, oh Father, this bitter cup, let it pass from me.
Were you there when they nailed him to the cross?
And we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong.
Were you there when they nailed him to the cross?
And we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong.
Sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble.
And we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds. But this
man has done nothing wrong. Were you there when they nailed him to the cross? And they take my blameless Jesus, and they drag him to the governor, to the mighty Roman governor, great Pilate, seated in his hall. Great Pilate on his judgment seat said, in this man, I find no fault. I find no fault in him. And Pilate washed his hands. But they cried out, saying,
Crucify him!
Crucify him!
Crucify him.
His blood be on our heads. Were you there when they pierced him in his side?
I can't breathe.
Were you there when they pierced him in the side?
I can't breathe.
Sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble.
I can't breathe.
Were you there when they pierced him in the side?
And they beat my loving Jesus. They spit on my precious Jesus. They dressed him up in a purple robe. They put a crown of thorns upon his head, and they pressed it down. Oh, they pressed it down, and they mocked my sweet King Jesus.
On Calvary, they crucified my Jesus. They nailed him to the cruel tree, and the hammer rang through Jerusalem's streets. The hammer rang through Jerusalem's streets. Dear editor, the issue of racism is not a black one, nor is it actually relevant at this time.
Mary, weeping Mary, sees her poor little Jesus on the cross. Mary, weeping Mary, sees her sweet baby Jesus on the cruel cross, hanging between two thieves.
And we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. Were you there when they laid him in a tomb?
Khalif Browder was 16, accused of stealing a backpack.
Were you there when they laid him in a tomb?
Spent 3 years in jail awaiting a trial that never came. Suffering physical and psychological abuse and torture at the hands of guards and inmates at the jail.
Sometimes it causes me to tremble.
He spent 2 years alone in solitary confinement.
Tremble.
At times, he talked to himself.
Tremble.
And then he realized too often he also answered himself back.
Were you there when they laid him in a tomb?
At 19, he was released from jail. At 22, he killed himself.
Were you there when they crucified
And Jesus, my lonesome Jesus, called out once more to his Father, saying,
My God, why hast thou forsaken me?
And he drooped his head and died.